Finis, Frank Lillie Pollack, I'm getting tired, complained Davis, lounging in the window of the physics building, and sleepy. It's after 11 o'clock. This makes the fourth night I've sat up to see your new star, and it'll be the last. Why, the thing was billed to appear 3 weeks ago. Are you tired, Miss Warder? Asked Eastwood, and the girl glanced up with a quick flush and a negative murmur. Eastwood made the reflection and knew that she certainly was painfully shy. She was almost as plain as she was shy, though her hair had an unusual beauty of its own, fine as silk and colored like palest flame. Probably she had brains. Eastwood had seen her reading some extremely deep books, but she seemed to have no amusements, few interests. She worked daily at the Art Students' League, and boarded where he did, and he had thus come to ask her with the devices to watch for the new star from the laboratory windows on the heights. "Do you really think that it's worthwhile to wait any longer, Professor?" inquired Mrs. Davis, concealing a yawn. Eastwood was somewhat annoyed by the continued failure of the star to show itself, and he hated to be called professor, being only an assistant professor of physics. "I don't know," he answered somewhat curtly. "This is the 12th night that I have waited for it. Of course, it would have been a mathematical miracle if astronomers should have solved such a problem exactly, though they've been figuring on it for a quarter of a century." The new physics building of Columbia University was about 12 stories high. The physics laboratory occupied the 9th and 10th floors, with the astronomical rooms above it, an arrangement which would have been impossible before the invention of the oil vibration cushion, which practically isolated the instrument rooms from the Earth. Eastwood had arranged a small telescope at the window, and below them spread the illuminated map of Great New York, sending up a faintly musical roar. The streets were crowded, as they had been every night since the 5th of the month, when the great new star, or sun, was expected to come into view. Some error had been made in the calculations, though, as Eastwood said, astronomers had been figuring on them for 25 years. It was, in fact, nearly 40 years since Professor Adolphe Bernier first announced his theory of a limited universe at the International Congress of Sciences in Paris, where it was counted as little more than a masterpiece of imagination. Professor Bernier did not believe that the universe was infinite. Somewhere, he argued, the universe must have a center, which is the pivot for its revolution. The moon revolves around the Earth, the planetary system revolves about the sun, the solar system revolves about one of the fixed stars, and this whole system in its turn undoubtedly revolves around some more distant point. But this sort of progression must definitely stop somewhere. Somewhere there must be a central sun, a vast incandescent body which does not move at all. And as a sun is always larger and hotter than its satellites, therefore the body at the center of the universe must be of an immensity and temperature beyond anything known or imagined. It was objected that this hypothetical body should then be large enough to be visible from the Earth, and Professor Bernier replied that someday it undoubtedly would be visible. Its light had simply not yet had time to reach the Earth. The passage of light from the nearest of the fixed stars is a matter of 3 years, and there must be many stars so distant that their rays have not yet reached us. The great central sun must be so inconceivably remote that perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands of years would elapse before its light should burst upon the solar system. All this was contemptuously classed as newspaper science till the extraordinary mathematical revival a little after the middle of the 20th century afforded the means of verifying it. Following the new theorems discovered by Professor Burnside, of Princeton, and elaborated by Dr. Danica, of Tokyo, astronomers succeeded in calculating the arc of the sun's movements through space, and its ratio to the orbit of its satellites. With this as a basis, it was possible to follow the widening circles, the consecutive systems of the heavenly bodies and their rotations. The theory of Professor Bernier was justified. It was demonstrated that there really was a gigantic mass of incandescent matter, which, whether the central point of the universe or not, appeared to be without motion. The weight and distance of this new sun were approximately calculated, and, the speed of light being known, it was an easy matter to reckon when its rays would reach the Earth. It was then estimated that the approaching rays would arrive at the Earth in 26 years, and that was 26 years ago. 3 weeks had passed since the date when the new heavenly body was expected to become visible, and it had not yet appeared. Popular interest had risen to a high pitch. stimulated by innumerable newspaper and magazine articles, and the streets were nightly thronged with excited crowds armed with opera glasses and star maps, while at every corner a telescope man had planted his tripod instrument at a nickel a look. Similar scenes were taking place in every civilized city on the globe. It was generally supposed that the new luminary would appear in size about midway between Venus and the Moon. Better informed persons expected something like the Sun, and a syndicate of capitalists quietly leased large areas on the coast of Greenland in anticipation of a great rise in temperature and a northward movement in population. Even the business situation was appreciably affected by the public uncertainty and excitement. There was a decline in stocks, and a minor religious sect boldly prophesied the end of the world. "I've had enough of this," said Davis, looking at his watch again. "Are you ready to go, Grace? By the way, isn't it getting warmer?" It had been a sharp February day, but the temperature was certainly rising. Water was dripping from the roofs, and from the icicles that fringed the window ledges, as if a warm wave had suddenly arrived. "What's that light?" suddenly asked Alice Warder, who was lingering by the open window. "It must be moonrise," said Eastwood, though the illumination of the horizon was almost like daybreak. Davis abandoned his intention of leaving, and they watched the east grow pale and flushed till at last a brilliant white disk heaved itself above the horizon. It resembled the full moon, but as if trebled in luster, and the streets grew almost as light as by day. "Good heavens, that must be the new star, after all," said Davis in an awed voice. "No, it's only the moon. This is the hour and the minute for her rising," answered Eastwood, who had grasped the cause of the phenomenon. "But the new sun must have appeared on the other side of the earth. Its light is what makes the moon so brilliant. It will rise here just as the sun does, no telling how soon. It must be brighter than was expected and maybe hotter," he added with a vague uneasiness. "Isn't it getting very warm in here?" said Mrs. Davis, loosening her jacket. "Couldn't you turn off some of the steam heat?" Eastwood turned it all off, for, in spite of the open window, the room was really growing uncomfortably close. But the warmth appeared to come from without. It was like a warm spring evening, and the icicles were breaking loose from the cornices. For half an hour they leaned from the windows with but desultory conversation, and below them the streets were black with people and whitened with upturned faces. The brilliant moon rose higher, and the mildness of the night sensibly increased. It was after midnight when Eastwood first noticed the reddish flush tinging the clouds low in the east, and he pointed it out to his companions. "That must be it at last," he exclaimed, with a thrill of vibrating excitement at what he was going to see, a cosmic event unprecedented in intensity. The brightness waxed rapidly. "By Jove, see it redden!" Davis ejaculated. "It's getting lighter than day and hot. Phew." The whole eastern sky glowed with a deepening pink that extended half round the horizon. Sparrows chirped from the roofs, and it looked as if the disk of the unknown star might at any moment be expected to lift above the Atlantic, but it delayed long. The heavens continued to burn with myriad hues, gathering at last to a fiery furnace glow on the skyline. Mrs. Davis suddenly screamed. An American flag blowing freely from its staff on the roof of the tall building had all at once burst into flame. Low in the east lay a long streak of intense fire which broadened as they squinted with watering eyes. It was as if the edge of the world had been heated to whiteness. The brilliant moon faded to a feathery white film in the glare. There was a confused outcry from the observatory overhead, and a crash of something being broken, and as the strange new sunlight fell through the window the onlookers leapt back as if a blast furnace had been opened before them. The glass cracked and fell inward. Something like the sun, but magnified 50 times in size and hotness, was rising out of the sea. An iron instrument table by the window began to smoke with an acrid smell of varnish. "What the devil is this, Eastwood?" shouted Davis accusingly. From the streets rose a sudden, enormous wail of fright and pain, the outcry of a million throats at once, and the roar of a stampede followed. The pavements were choked with struggling, panic-stricken people in the fierce glare, and above the din arose the clanging rush of fire engines and trucks. Smoke began to rise from several points below Central Park, and 2 or 3 church chimes pealed crazily. The observers from overhead came running down the stairs with a thunderous trampling, for the elevator man had deserted his post. "Here, we've got to get out of this," shouted Davis, seizing his wife by the arm and hustling her toward the door. "This place'll be on fire directly, hold on. You can't go down into that crush on the street," Eastwood cried, trying to prevent him, but Davis broke away and raced down the stairs, half carrying his terrified wife. Eastwood got his back against the door in time to prevent Alice from following them. "There's nothing in this building that will burn, Miss Warder," he said as calmly as he could. "We had better stay here for the present. It would be sure death to get involved in that stampede below. Just listen to it." The crowds on the street seemed to sway to and fro in contending waves, and the cries, curses, and screams came up in a savage chorus. The heat was already almost blistering to the skin, though they carefully avoided the direct rays, and instruments of glass in the laboratory cracked loudly one by one. A vast cloud of dark smokes began to rise from the harbor, where the shipping must have caught fire, and something exploded with a terrific report. A few minutes later half a dozen fires broke out in the lower part of the city, rolling up volumes of smoke that faded to a thin mist in the dazzling light. The great new sun was now fully above the horizon, and the whole east seemed ablaze. The stampede in the streets had quieted all at once, for the survivors had taken refuge in the nearest houses, and the pavements were black with motionless forms of men and women. "I'll do whatever you say," said Alice, who was deadly pale, but remarkably collected. Even at that moment Eastwood was struck by the splendor of her ethereally brilliant hair that burned like pale flame above her pallid face. "But we can't stay here, can we?" "No," replied Eastwood, trying to collect his faculties in the face of this catastrophic revolution of nature. "We'd better go to the basement, I think." In the basement were deep vaults used for the storage of delicate instruments, and these would afford shelter for a time at least. It occurred to him as he spoke that perhaps temporary safety was the best that any living thing on earth could hope for, but he led the way down the well staircase. They had gone down 6 or 7 flights when a gloom seemed to grow upon the air, with a welcome relief. It seemed almost cool, and the sky had clouded heavily, with the appearance of polished and heated silver. A deep but distant roaring arose and grew from the southeast, and they stopped on the second landing to look from the window. A vast black mass seemed to fill the space between sea and sky, and it was sweeping toward the city, probably from the harbor, Eastwood thought, at a speed that made it visibly grow as they watched it. "A cyclone and a waterspout," muttered Eastwood, appalled. He might have foreseen it from the sudden, excessive evaporation and the heating of the air. The gigantic black pillar drove toward them swaying and reeling, and a gale came with it, and a wall of impenetrable mist behind. As Eastwood watched its progress he saw its cloudy bulk illumined momentarily by a dozen lightning-like flashes, and a moment later, above its roar, came the tremendous detonations of heavy cannon. The forts and the warships were firing shells to break the waterspout, but the shots seemed to produce no effect. It was the city's last and useless attempt at resistance. A moment later forts and ships alike must have been engulfed. "Hurry! This building will collapse!" Eastwood shouted. They rushed down another flight, and heard the crash with which the monster broke over the city. A deluge of water, like the emptying of a reservoir, thundered upon the street, and the water was steaming hot as it fell. There was a rending crash of falling walls, and in another instant the physics building seemed to be twisted around by a powerful hand. The walls blew out, and the whole structure sank in a chaotic mass, but the tough steel frame was practically unwreckable, and, in fact, the upper portion was simply bent down upon the lower stories, peeling off most of the shell of masonry and stucco. Eastwood was stunned as he was hurled to the floor, but when he came to himself he was still upon the landing, which was tilted at an alarming angle. A tangled mass of steel rods and beams hung a yard over his head, and a huge steel girder had plunged down perpendicularly from above, smashing everything in its way. Wreckage choked the well of the staircase, a mass of plaster, bricks, and shattered furniture surrounded him, and he could look out in almost every direction through the rent iron skeleton. A yard away Alice was sitting up, mechanically wiping the mud and water from her face, and apparently uninjured. Tepid water was pouring through the interstices of the wreck entrance, though it did not appear to be raining. A steady, powerful gale had followed the whirlwind, and it brought a little coolness with it. Eastwood inquired perfunctorily of Alice if she were hurt, without being able to feel any degree of interest in the matter. His faculty of sympathy seemed paralyzed. I don't know. I thought that we were all dead. The girl murmured in a sort of daze. What was it? Is it all over? I think it's only beginning, Eastwood answered dully. The gale had brought up more clouds and the skies were thickly overcast, but shining white hot. Presently the rain came down in almost scalding floods, and as it fell upon the hissing streets it steamed again into the air. In 3 minutes all the world was choked with hot vapor, and from the roar and splash the streets seemed to be running rivers. The downpour seemed too violent to endure, and after an hour it did cease, while the city reeked with mist. Through the whirling fog Eastwood caught glimpses of ruined buildings, vast heaps of debris, all the wreckage of the greatest city of the 20th century. Then the torrents fell again, like a cataract, as if the waters of the earth were shuttle-kicking between sea and heaven. With a jarring tremor of the ground a landslide went down into the Hudson. The atmosphere was like a vapor bath, choking and sickening. The physical agony of respiration aroused Alice from a sort of stupor, and she cried out pitifully that she would die. The strong wind drove the hot spray and steam through the shattered building till it seemed impossible that human lungs could extract life from the semi-liquid that had replaced the air, but the two lived. After hours of this parboiling the rain slackened, and, as the clouds parted, Eastwood caught a glimpse of a familiar form halfway up the heavens. It was the sun, the old sun, looking small and watery. But the intense heat and brightness told that the enormous body still blazed behind the clouds. The rain seemed to have ceased definitely, and the hard, shining whiteness of the sky grew rapidly hotter. The heat of the air increased to an oven-like degree, the mists were dissipated, the clouds licked up, and the earth seemed to dry itself almost immediately. The heat from the two suns beat down simultaneously till it became a monstrous terror, unendurable. An odor of smoke began to permeate the air, there was a dazzling shimmer over the streets, and great clouds of mist arose from the bay, but these appeared to evaporate before they could darken the sky. The piled wreck of the building sheltered the two refugees from the direct rays of the new sun, now almost overhead, but not from the penetrating heat of the air. But the body will endure almost anything, short of tearing asunder, for a time at least. It is the finer mechanism of the nerves that suffers most. Alice lay face down among the bricks, gasping and moaning. The blood hammered in Eastwood's brain, and the strangest mirages flickered before his eyes. Alternately he lapsed into heavy stupors, and awoke to the agony of the day. In his lucid moments he reflected that this could not last long, and tried to remember what degree of heat would cause death. Within an hour after the drenching rains he was feverishly thirsty, and the skin felt as if peeling from his whole body. This fever and horror lasted until he forgot that he had ever known another state. But at last the west reddened, and the flaming sun went down. It left the familiar planet high in the heavens, and there was no darkness until the usual hour, though there was a slight lowering of the temperature. But when night did come it brought life-giving coolness, and though the heat was still intense it seemed temperate by comparison. More than all, the kindly darkness seemed to set a limit to the cataclysmic disorders of the day. Oof! This is heavenly, said Eastwood, drawing long breaths and feeling mind and body revived in the gloom. It won't last long, replied Alice, and her voice sounded extraordinarily calm through the darkness. The heat will come again when the new sun rises in a few hours. We might find some better place in the meanwhile, a deep cellar, or we might get into the subway, Eastwood suggested. It would be no use. Don't you understand? I have been thinking it all out. After this, the new sun will always shine, and we could not endure it even another day. The wave of heat is passing round the world as it revolves, and in a few hours the whole earth will be a burnt-up ball. Very likely we are the only people left alive in New York, or perhaps in America. She seemed to have taken the intellectual initiative, and spoke with an assumption of authority that amazed him. But there must be others, said Eastwood, after thinking for a moment. Other people have found sheltered places, or miners, or men underground. They would have been drowned by the rain. At any rate, there will be none left alive by tomorrow night. Think of it, she went dreamily. For 1,000 years this wave of fire has been rushing toward us, while life has been going on so happily in the world, so unconscious that the world was doomed all the time. And now this is the end of life. I don't know, Eastwood said slowly. It may be the end of human life, But there must be some forms that will survive, some microorganisms perhaps capable of resisting high temperatures, if nothing higher. The seed of life will be left at any rate, and that is everything. Evolution will begin over again, producing new types to suit the changed conditions. I only wish I could see what creatures will be here in a few thousand years. But I can't realize it at all, this thing. He cried passionately, after a pause. Is it real? Or have we all gone mad? It seems too much like a bad dream. The rain crashed down again as he spoke, and the earth steamed, though not with the dense reek of the day. For hours the waters roared and splashed against the earth in hot billows till the streets were foaming yellow rivers, dammed by the wreck of fallen buildings. There was a continual rumble as earth and rock slid into the East River, and at last the Brooklyn Bridge collapsed with a thunderous crash and splash that made all Manhattan vibrate. A gigantic billow like a tidal wave swept up the river from its fall. The downpour slackened and ceased soon after. The moon began to shed an obscured but brilliant light through the clouds. Presently the east commenced to grow luminous, and this time there could be no doubt as to what was coming. Alice crept closer to the man as the grey light rose upon the watery air. "Kiss me," she whispered suddenly, throwing her arms around his neck. He could feel her trembling. "Say you love me. Hold me in your arms. There is only an hour, don't be afraid. Try to face it bravely," stammered Eastwood. "I don't fear it, not death. But I have never lived. I have always been timid and wretched and afraid to speak, and I've almost wished for suffering and misery or anything rather than to be stupid and dumb and dead. The way I've always been. I've never dared to tell anyone what I was, what I wanted. I've been afraid all my life, but I'm not afraid now. I have never lived. I have never been happy, and now we must die together." It seemed to Eastwood the cry of the perishing world. He held her in his arms and kissed her wet, tremulous face that was strained to his. The twilight was gone before they knew it. The sky was blue already, with crimson flakes mounting to the zenith, and the heat was growing once more intense. "This is the end, Alice," said Eastwood, and his voice trembled. She looked at him, her eyes shining with an unearthly softness and brilliancy, and turned her face to the east. There, in crimson and orange, flamed the last dawn that human eyes would ever see.